At 0730 on April 15, 1945, Private First Class Harold Gonsalves crouched behind a jagged volcanic outcrop on the lower slopes of Mount Yae-Take, watching Japanese mortar rounds explode in clusters across the hillside where his forward observer team was trying to direct artillery fire. 19 years old, 14 days on Okinawa, 0 missions completed without casualties. 1,500 Japanese soldiers from Colonel Udo's force had turned Mount Yae-Take into a fortress of interconnected caves, spider holes, and camouflaged bunkers bristling with 25mm anti-aircraft guns, repositioned as direct-fire weapons. The mountain dominated the entire Motobu Peninsula. Whoever controlled its summit controlled the northern approaches to the invasion beaches. The 6th Marine Division had been grinding uphill for 4 days. Progress measured in yards. Casualties measured in dozens. Gonsalves was part of an 8-man forward observer team from Battery L, 4th Battalion, 15th Marines. Their job was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Get close enough to Japanese positions to spot targets. Radio coordinates back to the 105mm howitzers positioned 3 miles behind the lines. Adjust fire. Repeat. But Mount Yae-Take wasn't cooperating. The Japanese had engineered their defensive positions into the mountain's natural cave systems. Artillery shells that would obliterate surface targets simply bounced off rock or collapsed empty tunnels. The forward observers needed eyes on the actual firing ports, the actual trench lines, the actual reverse slopes where Japanese infantry massed before counterattacks, which meant getting within 200 yards of enemy positions, sometimes closer. The mathematics were brutal. In the first 3 days of the Mount Yae-Take assault, the 6th Marine Division had deployed 7 forward observer teams to the forward slopes. 5 had been forced back by concentrated fire before establishing positions. 2 had made it close enough to call fire missions. Both teams had taken casualties. 1 had lost its radio operator to a sniper. The other had lost its officer to a mortar round that detonated 15 feet from their observation post. The radio traffic Gonsalves monitored told the same story across different frequencies. Forward observers calling for artillery. Artillery batteries responding with fire missions. Forward observers adjusting. Then static. Then new voices on the same frequencies. The problem wasn't the guns. The 4th Battalion's 105mm howitzers could drop shells with reasonable accuracy at maximum range. Gonsalves had trained as a cannoneer on 75 and 105mm guns at Camp Pendleton. He understood the weapon systems, understood the ballistics, understood that without precise forward observation, artillery was just expensive noise. The problem was getting close enough to observe without getting killed in the process. Gonsalves had volunteered for forward observer duty in November 1944 when the 6th Marine Division was forming up at Guadalcanal. He'd served with the 22nd Marines through the Marshall Islands campaign, Engebe, Perry Island, the liberation of Guam. Enough combat to know what worked and what got people killed. Forward observation got people killed. But somebody had to do it. The infantry couldn't advance without artillery suppression. Artillery couldn't suppress without forward observers. The chain only worked if every link held. That morning, Gonsalves' commanding officer had called for volunteers. The team needed to push forward. Establish a new observation post within direct line of sight of Japanese positions on the mountain's eastern approach. String telephone wire back to the battalion command post because radio signals were unreliable in the broken terrain. 3 men, 1 officer, 2 enlisted, telephone wire, binoculars, maps, no radio, no backup. If you want to see how Gonsalves and his team reached their objective under fire, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories of courage that deserve to be remembered. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Gonsalves. The mission briefing had been straightforward. The officer would lead. Gonsalves and 1 other Marine would follow. They would move during a scheduled artillery barrage when Japanese defenders would be under cover. They would carry 4 spools of field telephone wire. They would string the wire as they advanced. When they reached a suitable observation point, they would dig in and start calling fire missions. The briefing did not mention the 11 forward observers who had been wounded or killed in similar attempts over the previous 72 hours. It did not need to. Everyone knew the numbers. Gonsalves checked his gear one final time. Entrenching tool, canteen, ammunition, wire cutters, medical kit, the photograph of his sister Marie that he carried in his helmet liner. At 07:55, the American artillery barrage began. 105mm shells screamed overhead and detonated in rolling thunder across the Japanese positions. The officer gave the signal. 3 Marines left cover and started uphill through smoke and flying rock fragments toward an enemy that had already killed or wounded dozens of men attempting exactly what they were about to attempt. The ground shook with each impact. Gonsalves moved in a crouch, one hand gripping the spool of telephone wire, the other steadying himself against the loose volcanic rock that covered the slope. 20 yards ahead, the officer navigated between shell craters still smoking from the preparatory bombardment. The 3rd Marine followed behind Gonsalves, feeding wire from his own spool to maintain redundancy. The theory was sound: string dual lines so that if one got cut by shrapnel or gunfire, the other might survive. But theory assumed you could move fast enough to reach cover before the enemy recovered from the artillery barrage. Theory assumed the enemy would stay under cover during the barrage. At 08:12, the American artillery shifted to targets further up the mountain. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. Gonsalves could hear his own breathing, could hear loose rocks skittering down slope, could hear the officer ahead of him unwinding wire with mechanical precision. The observation point they were aiming for was a natural depression in the terrain approximately 230 yards upslope from their starting position. From there, they would have direct line of sight to the network of Japanese fighting positions dug into the reverse slope. The intelligence maps showed at least 6 machine gun nests, 2 mortar pits, and what aerial reconnaissance suggested might be a cave entrance large enough to hide a full infantry company. But the intelligence maps were 4 days old. In 4 days, Japanese combat engineers could transform terrain, could dig new positions, could camouflage approaches, could set ambushes. Gonsalves had learned on Guam to trust nothing except what he could see with his own eyes. Even then, trust carefully. The slope steepened, progress slowed. The wire caught on jagged rocks, snagged on the twisted remains of a dead tree that had been shredded by artillery. Gonsalves freed it without stopping, kept moving. The officer set the pace, not fast enough to make noise, not slow enough to present a stationary target if someone was watching. Someone was always watching. At 08:27, the first Japanese rifle shot cracked across the hillside. The round hit rock 10 feet to the officer's left and ricocheted with a distinctive whine. The officer dropped flat. Gonsalves went down half a second later. The 3rd Marine pressed himself into a shallow depression that might stop shrapnel, but wouldn't stop a direct hit from anything. Single shot, no follow-up. Either a ranging round or a warning. Either way, the Japanese knew they were coming. The officer hand-signaled. Keep moving, faster now. The window was closing. Every second they remained exposed was a second for Japanese observers to calculate range, to coordinate fire, to bring weapons to bear. Gonsalves rose and moved uphill in a low run. His boots found purchase on loose scree. The wire spool in his left hand grew lighter as more line paid out behind him. 50 yards to the observation point. 40. The terrain offered minimal cover. A few scattered boulders, some dead vegetation. Nothing that would stop sustained fire. At 08:33, Japanese mortar rounds began landing. Not the heavy impacts of artillery, the sharper cracks of infantry mortars. 70mm or 81mm. Purpose-built for exactly this situation. Mobile enough to reposition quickly. Accurate enough to hit man-sized targets at known ranges. The first round landed 40 yards behind them. The second landed 30 yards to their right. The third landed 20 yards ahead and 15 yards left. The Japanese mortar crews were walking rounds across the slope, searching, adjusting, converging. The mathematics of indirect fire worked both ways. Gonsalves understood the pattern, understood what it meant when mortar crews started bracketing. 3 more rounds and they would have the range. Maybe 4. Not many. The officer reached the observation point first, dove into the depression. Gonsalves followed 5 seconds later, landed hard, rolled, came up checking the wire spool. Still intact, still feeding line. The 3rd Marine slid into the depression as a mortar round detonated exactly where they had been standing 8 seconds earlier. Fragments whined overhead. The concussion wave hit like a physical blow. Gonsalves' ears rang. He blinked dirt from his eyes and started scanning the terrain ahead through the smoke, looking for targets, looking for the fighting positions they had risked their lives to observe. What he saw made his stomach tighten. The Japanese positions were closer than the intelligence maps indicated. Much closer. Close enough that he could see individual soldiers moving between firing ports. Close enough that when they opened fire, there would be nowhere to hide. The Japanese had positioned their main defensive line along a natural ridgeline 160 yards directly ahead. Gonsalves counted fighting positions through the drifting smoke. 7 rifle pits, connected by communication trenches, 3 machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire, 2 mortar pits set back from the forward edge, all of it camouflaged with vegetation and netting that would be invisible from the air, but was clearly visible from their current angle. The positions covered every approach to the summit. Any Marine infantry attempting to advance up this slope would walk directly into a kill zone with no cover and no chance, which was exactly why the forward observer team had pushed this far forward, to identify those positions, to call artillery fire that could suppress or destroy them before the infantry made their assault. The officer was already connecting the telephone wire to the field phone. His hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the mortar rounds still impacting across the hillside. Gonsalves unfolded his map and marked the Japanese positions with precise coordinates, range, bearing, estimated size of each position. The information that would let the artillery batteries 3 miles behind them put steel on target. The field phone crackled to life. The officer cranked the handle and established contact with the battalion fire direction center. His voice was calm, professional. He read off the first set of coordinates, requested high explosive rounds, adjusted for wind and elevation. The fire direction center acknowledged. Estimated time to first rounds, 90 seconds. Gonsalves raised his binoculars and watched the Japanese positions, waiting, counting seconds. At 95 seconds, he heard the distinctive shriek of incoming American artillery. The first salvo landed 200 yards beyond the target ridge. Long. The officer called the adjustment. Down 200. Repeat fire. The second salvo landed 30 yards short. Gonsalves could see dirt fountaining into the air, but no direct hits on the fighting positions. The Japanese had dug deep, built overhead cover, reinforced their positions with logs and sandbags and whatever materials they could scavenge. The officer adjusted again. Up 30, left 20. Fire for effect. The third salvo walked directly across the ridgeline. 105mm high-explosive rounds detonated in sequence. Gonsalves watched through his binoculars as one of the machine gun positions took a direct hit. The blast tore through the overhead cover and collapsed the position. A second round landed in the communication trench between 2 rifle pits. Effective, but not enough. The Japanese had more positions than the initial aerial reconnaissance suggested. As American artillery suppressed the forward positions, infantry emerged from camouflage spider holes on the flanks, positions that hadn't appeared on any map. Positions that were now bringing rifle fire to bear on the forward observer team's location. Rounds started impacting the rocks around their depression. The distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles mixed with the heavier thump of Nambu machine guns. The Japanese had spotted them, had identified them as forward observers, had made them a priority target. The officer kept calling adjustments. Shift fire right 50 yards. New target. Suspected infantry assembly area. Fire 3 rounds. Adjust. The telephone wire stretched across the open ground behind them vibrated with each transmission. Vulnerable. Exposed. A single piece of shrapnel could sever the connection and leave them blind and deaf. At 0852, a Japanese grenade landed 15 feet from their position. It detonated before anyone could react. The blast showered them with rock fragments. Gonsalves felt something hot slice across his left forearm. Not deep, not serious. He ignored it and kept scanning for targets. The officer called another fire mission. The artillery responded. Shells impacted across the suspected assembly area. Secondary explosions suggested they had hit something important. Ammunition storage, possibly a mortar position. The Japanese return fire intensified. More grenades, more rifle fire. A sustained burst from a Nambu machine gun that chewed rock 2 feet above Gonsalves' head and forced him flat against the bottom of the depression. The 3rd Marine had taken shrapnel across his shoulder. Not serious enough to evacuate, serious enough to bleed through his utilities. The officer made a decision. They needed to advance closer. The current position was effective, but limited. They could see the forward positions, but not the reverse slopes where Japanese reserves were staging. Not the cave entrances where troops moved in and out. Not the supply routes that kept the defensive positions functioning. They needed better observation, which meant moving forward another 100 yards, under fire, with Japanese infantry already zeroing in on their current location. The officer looked at Gonsalves, looked at the 3rd Marine, then looked at the slope ahead, where moving would mean complete exposure for at least 30 seconds. 30 seconds was a lifetime under concentrated fire, but the infantry was scheduled to assault in 4 hours. Without better forward observation, they would be advancing blind into positions that artillery had only partially suppressed. The mathematics were simple. Risk 3 lives now, or risk 300 lives later. The officer gave the signal at 0903. They would move in sequence. He would go first, establish the new position. Gonsalves would follow with the wire spool. The 3rd Marine would provide covering fire from their current position, then follow once the first 2 were in cover. Standard fire and movement doctrine, textbook tactics. Except textbooks assumed you had suppressing fire, assumed you had smoke, assumed the enemy wasn't watching your every move through rifle sights from 120 yards away. They had none of those advantages. The officer rolled out of the depression and sprinted uphill. Japanese rifle fire erupted immediately. Rounds cracked past him, kicked up dirt at his feet. He made it 20 yards before diving behind a cluster of rocks barely large enough to hide a man. He hand-signaled, "Clear, move." Gonsalves grabbed the wire spool and broke cover. The first 3 steps were the worst. Every instinct screamed to stay low, stay hidden. But staying low meant moving slow, and moving slow meant more time under fire. He ran uphill in a crouch that was part sprint and part controlled fall across uneven ground. A Nambu machine gun opened up from the ridgeline. The gun crew had been waiting, had tracked the officer's movement, had anticipated the second man would follow. The rounds made a sound like canvas ripping. Gonsalves felt the shockwave as tracers passed close enough to disturb the air. He covered 15 yards, 20. The wire spool unwound behind him in a thin copper lifeline back to the battalion command post, back to the artillery batteries, back to the only thing that could keep the Japanese from overrunning Marine positions across the entire northern sector. At 25 yards, his boot caught on loose rock. He stumbled, went down hard on his left knee. The wire spool bounced from his grip. For half a second, he froze, completely exposed, no cover within reach. Japanese rifle fire converging on a stationary target. Training took over. He snatched the wire spool, surged forward, made the last 10 yards in 4 steps, and threw himself behind the rocks where the officer had taken position. Impact drove the air from his lungs. He gasped, rolled, checked the wire. Still intact, still connected. The officer was already scanning for the next position. Another 50 yards, another cluster of volcanic rock, another sprint across open ground under observation from enemy positions that had already demonstrated their accuracy. The 3rd Marine broke cover from the original position, ran the gauntlet they had just survived, made it halfway before a Japanese grenade landed in his path. The explosion caught him in the open. Fragments tore through his utilities. He went down, stayed down for 3 seconds, 4, then pushed himself up and completed the run. Collapsed behind their rocks, bleeding from his shoulder and both legs. Not life-threatening wounds, not yet, but enough blood loss to make the next 50 yards even more dangerous. The officer applied field dressings with mechanical efficiency. Gonsalves strung the wire forward, prepared for the next movement. They had covered 70 yards from their original position, 70 yards closer to Japanese lines, 70 yards deeper into a kill zone that was growing more concentrated with every step. The new observation point they were targeting would put them within 80 yards of enemy positions, close enough to identify individual soldiers, close enough to call fire missions with devastating accuracy, also close enough that Japanese grenades would reach them easily, close enough that rifle fire would be point blank, close enough that if they got pinned down, extraction would be impossible. At 0917, American artillery shifted fire again. The shells impacted on the reverse slope where intelligence suggested Japanese reserves were staging. Good fire mission, effective suppression. But it meant the forward positions were no longer under artillery pressure, which meant Japanese infantry would be moving, repositioning, preparing to assault any forward observers stupid enough to push this close to their lines. Gonsalves watched the ridgeline through his binoculars, saw movement in the fighting positions, saw soldiers emerging from spider holes, counted heads, 12, 15, 20 Japanese infantry moving with purpose toward positions that offered direct line of sight to where 3 Marines were about to make their final approach. The officer checked his watch, calculated timing. The next artillery barrage was scheduled for 0930, 13 minutes. They could wait. Let the artillery soften the positions, move during the barrage when enemy heads were down. Or they could move now while Japanese infantry were still repositioning, still focused on the reverse slope, still reacting to the current fire mission rather than anticipating the next forward observer movement. The officer chose now, hand-signaled the 3rd Marine to stay, provide what covering fire he could manage while wounded, then looked at Gonsalves. Final position, final sprint. 80 yards from Japanese lines, with 20 enemy soldiers watching the approaches, and the window closing with every passing second. The officer went first at 0919, low sprint across broken ground toward a shallow ravine that offered the only covered approach to the final observation point. Japanese rifle fire tracked him immediately. Rounds snapped past, impacted rock. He made it 30 yards before going to ground behind a dead tree trunk that barely qualified as concealment. Gonsalves followed 10 seconds later. The wire spool was nearly empty, maybe 50 feet of line remaining, enough to reach the ravine, barely. He ran with his head down and his body bent almost parallel to the slope. The Nambu machine gun opened up again, long burst, sustained fire. The gun crew had his range. He felt a round tug at his utility jacket, felt another kick dirt across his boots, made the dead tree trunk and dropped flat beside the officer. His heart hammered, breath came in gasps. The wire spool showed 15 feet of line remaining. Not enough. They needed more wire to reach the ravine. The 3rd Marine understood without signals. He grabbed his own wire spool from their previous position, began crawling forward, dragging the spool behind him. Slow, exposed, bleeding from 3 separate wounds. Japanese riflemen spotted the movement and concentrated fire. Rounds chewed the ground around him. He kept crawling. Gonsalves watched through the gaps in the dead tree trunk, counted seconds. The 3rd Marine covered 10 yards, 15. A mortar round landed 20 feet to his left. The blast rolled him sideways. He lay still for 5 seconds, then resumed crawling. Reached the tree trunk, handed over the wire spool, collapsed. The officer connected the spools with a field splice, tested the connection. Solid. They had enough line now. He signaled Gonsalves. Final movement, 40 yards to the ravine. Then they would have their observation point. They moved together at 0924, both running. The officer carried the field telephone. Gonsalves fed wire from both spools. The ravine entrance was a natural cut in the volcanic rock, deep enough for cover, angled enough to provide defilade from direct fire. Perfect for forward observation if they could reach it alive. Japanese fire intensified, not random shots, coordinated volleys. The defenders had identified the ravine as the obvious objective, had prepared fields of fire to cover the approaches, had positioned soldiers specifically to deny that position to American observers. The officer made it to the ravine entrance first, turned to provide covering fire with his carbine. Gonsalves covered the last 15 yards in a stumbling run as rifle rounds cracked past his head, tumbled into the ravine, landed on sharp rock. The wire spools clattered beside him, both still feeding line, both still intact. The ravine was 8 feet deep and 30 feet long. The walls were near vertical volcanic rock. The floor was littered with shrapnel fragments and spent shell casings from previous engagements. At the far end, a natural ledge provided a firing step that offered direct observation over the Japanese positions. Perfect, if they survived long enough to use it. The officer set up the field telephone while Gonsalves moved to the observation ledge. From here, he could see everything: the machine gun positions, the mortar pits, the communication trenches, the cave entrances where Japanese soldiers moved supplies and ammunition, the assembly areas where fresh troops gathered before moving to forward positions. Target-rich environment. Every coordinate he called would save Marine lives, would suppress positions that could massacre the infantry assault scheduled for 1,300 hours. 4 hours from now. The phone crackled. Connection established. Fire Direction Center standing by for coordinates. Gonsalves began calling targets. The officer relayed through the field telephone. Artillery responded. Shells began impacting across the Japanese defensive network. Adjustments. Corrections. Walking fire across positions that had been invisible from any other vantage point. This was what forward observation was supposed to look like. This was why they had risked everything to get this close. At 0941, Japanese soldiers began emerging from the cave entrances, not retreating, advancing, moving toward the ravine in small groups, using the terrain, staying low. The defenders had identified the forward observer position, had decided elimination was more important than staying under cover during the artillery barrage. Gonsalves counted soldiers, 12 approaching from the left flank, 8 from the right, more emerging from positions he couldn't see. The Japanese were committing infantry to overrun their position. Standard counter-reconnaissance doctrine: find the observers, kill the observers, blind the artillery. The 3rd Marine had crawled to the ravine entrance, bleeding heavily now, still conscious, still capable of firing his rifle. 3 Marines, 1 ravine. Japanese infantry converging from multiple directions. The artillery barrage would continue for another 8 minutes. Then there would be a pause for barrel cooling and ammunition resupply. 8 minutes. Either the infantry reached them first, or the artillery killed enough attackers to break the assault. The mathematics were simple. The outcome was not. The officer kept calling fire missions. Gonsalves kept spotting targets. The 3rd Marine positioned himself at the ravine entrance and prepared to sell his life as expensively as possible when the Japanese infantry closed the final distance. At 0943, the first wave of Japanese infantry reached grenade range. Gonsalves saw the distinctive potato masher grenades arcing through the air toward the ravine entrance. The 3rd Marine opened fire with his M1 Garand. Controlled shots, aiming for center mass. 2 Japanese soldiers went down. The others scattered to cover. The grenades landed short, detonated 15 yards from the ravine. Fragments whined overhead, but caused no casualties. The Japanese infantry adjusted, moved closer, used the broken terrain for concealment, advanced inbounds while their comrades provided covering fire. The officer continued calling fire missions without pause. His voice remained steady despite rifle rounds cracking past the ravine entrance. Gonsalves fed him coordinates: machine gun position at bearing 270, mortar pit at bearing 315, suspected ammunition cache at bearing 295. The artillery batteries responded. Shells walked across the Japanese positions with increasing accuracy. A secondary explosion erupted from the suspected ammunition cache. The blast was massive, clearly more than a single artillery impact. Gonsalves had called fire on a major supply dump. Japanese soldiers scrambled away from the explosion as follow-up rounds bracketed the area. Good effect on target. Maybe 24 enemy casualties. Significant disruption to their defensive network. But the Japanese infantry advancing on the ravine kept coming. They had orders. Forward observers had to die. Everything else was secondary. At 0951, Japanese soldiers reached positions within 50 yards of the ravine, close enough that Gonsalves could see individual faces, could see the determination in their movements, could see grenades being prepared for throws that would actually reach their target. The 3rd Marine fired steadily. His M1 Garand barked 8-round clips into Japanese positions. Reload. Fire. Reload. Fire. He was bleeding from multiple wounds, weakening from blood loss. But his shooting remained accurate. 3 more Japanese soldiers fell. The advance stalled momentarily. The officer made another calculation. The ravine provided excellent observation of the reverse slope positions, but the forward fighting line was still partially obscured by terrain features. The Marine infantry assault would hit those forward positions first, would take the heaviest casualties there, unless artillery could suppress them effectively, which required forward observation from an even more advanced position, required getting close enough to see into the fighting positions themselves, required leaving the relative safety of the ravine and moving to the actual front line, where Japanese and American positions were separated by less than 100 yards. Suicide, by any reasonable standard. The ravine was already dangerously exposed. Moving forward from here meant certain contact with Japanese infantry, meant operating in a zone where artillery support would be impossible because American shells would endanger their own forward observers. But the mathematics hadn't changed. 3 lives versus 300. Personal survival versus mission accomplishment. The officer had made those calculations before. Every forward observer made those calculations. It was why forward observer casualties were 3 times higher than regular infantry casualties. At 09:58, the American artillery barrage paused for barrel cooling. Sudden silence across the hillside. The Japanese infantry used the pause to advance, moved quickly, closed the distance. 50 yards became 40, 40 became 30. The 3rd Marine's rifle went empty. He reached for another clip, fumbled it, blood loss affecting his coordination. He retrieved the clip, loaded, fired. The round went wide. His hands were shaking. The officer spoke into the field telephone. Final fire mission. Danger close. Grid coordinates that put American artillery shells within 100 yards of their own position. The Fire Direction Center questioned the coordinates, requested confirmation. The officer confirmed, repeated the grid, insisted. At 10:04, American shells began landing, not on the Japanese reverse slope positions, on the approaches to the ravine, where Japanese infantry had advanced to within 30 yards. The shells detonated in sequence, caught the attackers in the open. The concussion waves rolled through the ravine. Gonsalves felt his teeth rattle, felt pressure in his chest. When the barrage lifted, the Japanese advance had been shattered. Bodies littered the approach. The survivors had withdrawn to covered positions, regrouping. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the forward Japanese fighting line remained intact, remained untouched by artillery because it was too close to American positions, remained a kill zone, waiting for Marine infantry to walk into it 4 hours from now. The officer looked at Gonsalves, looked at the 3rd Marine who could barely hold his rifle, looked at the slope ahead where the frontline positions were dug in and waiting. Then he made the decision that every forward observer eventually faced. How far forward was far enough? How much risk was acceptable? When personal survival stopped mattering and mission accomplishment became the only calculation that counted. He pointed uphill toward the Japanese front line, field telephone in one hand, binoculars in the other. Gonsalves grabbed the remaining wire spool. The 3rd Marine checked his rifle. 3 Marines preparing to leave the only cover they had and advance into a gap between opposing forces where survival was measured in seconds and artillery support would be impossible. They left the ravine at 10:09. The officer led. Gonsalves followed with the field telephone and wire spool. The 3rd Marine remained behind, too weak from blood loss to continue. He would provide what covering fire he could manage and maintain the telephone connection to the Fire Direction Center. The gap between American and Japanese lines was 78 yards at this point. No man's land. Kill zone. Every piece of ground had been fought over. Shell craters overlapped. Shattered equipment littered the slope. The remains of previous Marine assaults. Previous attempts to close with an enemy that refused to retreat. Gonsalves and the officer moved in short rushes, 10 yards at a time, using craters for cover. The wire paid out behind them. Thin copper line connecting them to artillery batteries that could level mountains, but couldn't help them in this gap where friend and foe were too close together. At 10:15, they reached what had been a Japanese outpost position before American artillery had collapsed it the previous day. A crater 15 feet across and 8 feet deep. Good cover. Good observation. 40 yards from the Japanese main fighting line. Close enough to see individual soldiers moving in their trenches. Close enough to hear voices. Close enough that grenades became the primary weapon instead of rifles. The officer connected the field telephone, cranked the handle, established contact. The Fire Direction Center came through clearly despite the thin wire stretched across 400 yards of contested ground. Gonsalves raised his binoculars and began mapping targets. Machine gun bunker, bearing 090, range approximately 300 yards behind the front line. Reinforced overhead cover, camouflaged with vegetation. Active. The gun crew was watching the American positions, waiting for the infantry assault that intelligence said was coming. Mortar position, bearing 120, 2 tubes, 81mm ammunition stacked behind a rock wall. Crew of 6 soldiers, also waiting, also watching. Command post, bearing 155, identified by radio antenna and the number of soldiers moving in and out. Possibly Colonel Udo's forward headquarters. High-value target. The kind of target that could disrupt an entire defensive network if artillery could hit it precisely. The officer began calling coordinates, speaking quietly into the field telephone. The artillery batteries acknowledged. Estimated time to first rounds? 2 minutes. Gonsalves kept scanning, kept mapping, kept finding targets that would kill Marines if they weren't suppressed before the assault. At 10:19, the first American shells arrived, walked across the reverse slope with precision that only close forward observation could provide. Direct hit on the mortar position. The ammunition stockpile detonated. Secondary explosions rippled outward. The blast wave reached the crater where Gonsalves and the officer had taken position. Debris rained down. Adjust fire. Right 30 yards. The machine gun bunker. The shells responded, bracketed the position. Third round penetrated the overhead cover. The bunker collapsed. Gun silenced. Another threat eliminated before it could engage advancing Marines. The Japanese defenders recognized what was happening, recognized that forward observers had penetrated to point-blank range, recognized that every position they occupied was now visible to American artillery. Soldiers began emerging from fighting positions, not retreating, advancing, moving toward the crater where 2 Marines were systematically dismantling their defensive network, one artillery strike at a time. Japanese rifle fire intensified. Rounds cracked over the crater rim, forced Gonsalves and the officer to stay low. A grenade arced through the air, landed 10 feet from the crater, detonated. Fragments sang overhead. Another grenade, closer, 5 feet. The blast showered them with dirt. The officer kept calling fire missions. Gonsalves kept spotting. Another ammunition cache destroyed. Another fighting position collapsed. Another group of Japanese soldiers forced to abandon prepared defenses. The artillery was devastating, accurate, effective. Everything forward observation was supposed to achieve. But Japanese infantry was closing the distance, using the broken ground, moving between shell impacts, determined, disciplined. Gonsalves counted soldiers, 8 advancing from the left, 6 from the right, more emerging from positions he couldn't track, all converging on the crater. At 10:27, a Japanese soldier reached grenade range, close range. The throw was accurate. The grenade landed inside the crater, 3 feet from where Gonsalves knelt beside the officer, 3 feet from the field telephone that connected them to the artillery batteries, 3 feet from 2 Marines who had pushed further forward than any observer team had survived. Gonsalves saw the grenade, saw the fuse smoking, saw the officer frozen for half a second, processing, calculating, understanding that 3 feet was too far to throw it clear, too close to avoid the blast radius, too little time for anything except the choice that every Marine made when they raised their right hand and swore the oath. Save your brothers or save yourself. Never both. Not here, not now. Not when grenades landed in craters 40 yards from enemy lines, with artillery missions still incomplete and infantry assaults still depending on the coordinates only forward observers could provide. Harold Gonsalves was 19 years old. He had survived Ingebi and Perry Island, and Guam, and 14 days on Okinawa. He understood mathematics, understood probabilities, understood that some calculations ended with only one possible answer. He moved. Harold Gonsalves threw himself forward, covered the grenade with his body, absorbed the full force of the explosion. The blast killed him instantly. Fragments that would have shredded 2 Marines tore through him instead. The officer survived without serious injury. The field telephone survived. The wire connection to the artillery batteries survived. The officer grabbed the telephone, called the final coordinates through ringing ears and shock, targeted the command post he and Gonsalves had identified. The artillery responded, 3 salvos, direct hits. The command post collapsed. Colonel Udo's forward headquarters was destroyed. The defensive coordination for the entire northern sector was disrupted. Japanese infantry reached the crater 60 seconds later, found 1 Marine dead, 1 Marine still calling artillery fire. They opened fire. The officer took 2 rounds, went down. The field telephone went silent. But the damage was done. The forward observer mission was complete. Every major Japanese position on the eastern approach to Mount Yae-Take had been identified, mapped, targeted. The artillery batteries had the coordinates, had the range, had everything they needed to support the infantry assault. At 1300 hours, Marines from the 4th Regiment advanced up the slopes of Mount Yae-Take. They encountered Japanese resistance, heavy resistance, machine gun fire, mortar fire, rifle fire from prepared positions. But the positions that should have massacred them had been suppressed. The mortar pits had been destroyed. The machine gun bunkers had been collapsed. The ammunition caches had been detonated. The forward observers had done their job, had gotten close enough, had stayed alive long enough, had called the fire missions that made the difference between a successful assault and a slaughter. The Marines reached the summit of Mount Yae-Take on April 18th. 3 days of fighting, 700 Japanese soldiers killed. The stronghold that had anchored the entire Motobu Peninsula defense was broken. The northern approaches to the Okinawa invasion beaches were secured. Harold Gonsalves did not live to see it. His body was recovered from the crater on April 16th. 19 years old, forward observer, Battery L, 4th Battalion, 15th Marines. Killed in action, performing the mission that artillery depends on and infantry survives because of. The officer survived his wounds, was evacuated, returned to duty 6 weeks later. He submitted the Medal of Honor recommendation personally, described what happened in that crater, described the grenade, described the choice Gonsalves made without hesitation, described 2 lives saved because one Marine understood the mathematics and made the calculation that defined the Corps. President Harry Truman signed the Medal of Honor citation on June 19, 1946. The medal was presented to Gonsalves' sister Marie at ceremonies in San Francisco. Major General Henry Louis Larson made the presentation. The citation used words like conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity and stout-hearted and indomitable. The words were accurate, but they couldn't capture what happened in 3 seconds on a volcanic slope in Okinawa when a 19-year-old artillery spotter saw a grenade and moved toward it instead of away. Gonsalves was the only Hispanic Marine to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II. His name appears on monuments in Okinawa. A Marine Corps training facility bore his name for 12 years. His photograph hung in the Pentagon until 2025. But the real monument was built on April 15, 1945, built by a forward observer who volunteered for a suicide mission, who pushed deeper into enemy territory than any team had survived, who called artillery fire that saved hundreds of Marines he would never meet, who saw a grenade and made the choice that separated Marines from everyone else who wore a uniform. The mathematics were simple: 3 lives or 2, survive or complete the mission, personal safety or brothers in arms. Harold Gonsalves calculated the equation in less than a second, made his choice, paid the price. The Marines took Mount Yae-Take 3 days later because forward observers like Gonsalves got close enough to call fire that mattered, because somebody volunteered, because somebody understood that artillery without observation was just noise, because somebody decided that completing the mission was worth dying for. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about forward observers and artillery spotters and Marines who saved lives with courage and telephone wire and 3 seconds of decision. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Harold Gonsalves doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.